For almost 40 years, grown men kept coming out of the mountains telling the exact same story. Not similar stories, the same story. They described rivers that boiled without fire, water that burst out of the earth higher than the tallest pine trees, ground that hissed beneath their boots, and valleys where the air itself smelled like sulfur. Every one of them was called a liar, or a drunk, or a man who had spent too many winters alone. After a while, Washington stopped laughing, not because it believed them, because it was tired of hearing them. So instead of arguing, the government did something far more expensive. It assembled 34 men, loaded thousands of pounds of instruments, food, chemicals, and fragile glass onto the backs of pack animals, and sent them into the mountains with one simple instruction: come back with proof, or don't come back with the stories. None of them knew they were helping change the map of America. Most of them weren't scientists. Some couldn't have cared less whether the stories were true. They weren't hired to discover anything. They were hired to make sure the evidence survived the journey home. Because if one mule slipped, if one rope snapped, if one wooden crate shattered against a canyon wall, the expedition wouldn't lose equipment. It would lose proof. And America had already decided it wasn't going to believe another impossible story. Before we continue, tell me where you're listening from. I always enjoy seeing how far these forgotten stories travel. Now, let's head into the mountains. At first, there wasn't even a place to go. Nobody knew where it was. Not exactly. Mountains, certainly. Rivers that crossed them. The Bannock, the Crow, and other nations had moved through this country for generations. Mountain men had trapped its edges for decades before anyone else gave it a second thought. But the stories that traveled out of those mountains had no fixed point on any chart. They had directions instead. 3 days past the forks of the river, north of the last trading post anyone trusted, beyond a ridge nobody had bothered to name, because naming it would have meant admitting someone needed to go there. Every account began exactly where the last map ended. One man, describing water that burst out of solid rock, pointed toward country northwest, of where another man, describing the very same thing, pointed southeast. Both had been there. Neither could prove it, because neither had brought back anything except the telling. A story could travel for years on nothing but conviction. A map could not. A map needed a bearing, a distance, a landmark another man could walk to and confirm for himself. Without those, boiling rivers 3 days past the ridge were not a location. They were only a rumor, with a compass direction attached, and compass directions pointed almost anywhere, once the man giving them had gone home. It was easy to laugh at one trapper's account. It was much harder to explain why dozens of separate men, arriving from separate directions, across separate decades, kept describing water that should not exist, in roughly the same unmapped corner of the country. The stories matched, but matching stories still weren't a place. They were only a stronger rumor. For almost 40 years, eyewitnesses had carried the story as far as a story could go. They could tell people what they had seen. They could never tell another man exactly where to stand, to see it for himself. A story can survive on memory. A map cannot. And eventually, there was only one thing left to try: a journey. So, The journey had to be built before it could begin. Nothing about an expedition begins with wonder. It begins with weight. Every crate bound for the mountains had to be weighed twice. Once against what it held, and once against what the animal carrying it could survive carrying for 3 months. A barometer weighed against a sack of flour, a case of chemical bottles weighed against grain for the horses. The grain mattered, the chemicals mattered. Both had to arrive intact, or the expedition had failed before it ever reached the mountains. Henry Jackson built his own camera cases. Each fragile glass plate was wrapped in thick wool, carefully packed to survive the stumble of a mule on rocky ground. He tested every case the same way. He dropped it from waist height onto hard-packed dirt. Then he listened. If he heard breaking glass, he started over. The packers came last, and in many ways, they made everything before them possible. A poorly balanced load did not simply slow a mule. It rubbed the animal raw, changed its footing, and on the wrong trail, it could send an entire season's photographs crashing into a canyon. Everything depended on the diamond hitch, one continuous rope, tied in exactly the right pattern, until an awkward load rode as steadily as a shelf. Even then, one man often untied another man's work, only to tie it again himself, not because he doubted the other man, because no one in that country trusted a knot he hadn't checked with his own hands. Nobody thought less of him for it. That was simply how the work was done. Men who could tie a diamond hitch well earned less than the scientists standing beside them, but they were trusted with far more. Around the yard outside Ogden, nobody talked much about impossible rivers or boiling springs. They talked about which mules bit, which ones hated river crossings, whether the grass would come in early enough to save some grain, and whether last year's boots would survive another season on stone. Ferdinand Hayden moved quietly through the yard, checking instrument cases against his manifest. He was responsible for the expedition, but he also understood something important. Success would depend on dozens of small jobs, being done correctly by men whose names would never appear in his report. He would never be the man who noticed that one particular mule had begun favoring its left foreleg. That belonged entirely to the packers. On the last morning, the final crate was lashed down. The lead mule leaned gently into the rope, testing the weight settling across its back. Then it stood still. The load held. So, for the first time, the expedition did too. With everything finally packed, the journey could begin. The first days were not wilderness. They were road. Fence lines slowly gave way to open range. Open range gave way to country with no fences left to give. The town behind them became smaller each day, until it disappeared completely. Only a worn trail remained, but even that trail did not belong to the expedition. It had been traveled long before Hayden's men arrived. The Bannock and other native nations had followed these routes for generations. Hayden's expedition was not the first to cross this country. It was simply the first sent here to write it down. By the fourth day, the packers had already settled into a rhythm. The mules were loaded before first light, so they could travel during the cool hours. Water was planned a day in advance, because discovering a dry stretch too late, it could cost far more than time. Every evening, camp was broken down in exactly the same order. because a diamond hitch tied by a tired man in fading light could become tomorrow's disaster. None of the men were thinking about history. One packer thought about the crack forming in his left boot. Would it last until the next supply point? He wondered about the mule called Judge, who had already bitten 2 men, and would almost certainly find a third before they reached the mountains. He had never even heard the word geyser. On the 5th evening, one of the older hands stood looking north, beyond the last hills, toward the higher country, just catching the final light of day. After a long silence, he spoke. "Tomorrow," he said, "every pound starts getting heavier." Nobody asked him what he meant. They didn't need to. Soon enough, they would find out for themselves. And once they did, the wagons, the last comfortable machinery the expedition would ever know, would already be behind them. The mountains were waiting. By the time they reached the mountains, the expedition had already proven it could travel. Now, it had to prove it could survive. The wagons stopped at a place that did not look like an ending. Ground, mostly, rock rising ahead of it, but the wheels could not climb what the trail had become, and there was no argument to have about that. Wood and iron could take the expedition no farther. Everything the wagons had carried this far now had to be carried a different way, or not carried at all. For 2 days, the camp became a sorting yard. Wagon boxes stood open in a row, their contents spread out on canvas for a second weighing. Flour that had ridden loose in a wagon bed now had to be divided into sacks small enough for a single animal to balance. A few crates, too heavy or too awkward to survive a mule's back, no matter how they were repacked, were broken down entirely, their contents redistributed into smaller boxes a man could carry 2 of if he had to. What could not be reduced to a manageable size stayed behind with the wagons. Nobody spoke much while that sorting happened, because deciding what an expedition could no longer afford to carry was not a conversation. It was arithmetic, done quietly, crate by crate. Instrument cases built for a jolting wagon floor were re-cushioned for a jolting animal's back, which moved differently, and worse. Every hitch tied for the road was untied and retied for the mountain. A wagon forgave a badly balanced load by simply rolling forward regardless. A mule did not forgive anything. A pack set 2 inches too far to one side would work itself loose within a mile, and there would be no wagon bed underneath to catch what fell out of it. The packers worked without complaint and without hurry, because hurry was how loads got tied wrong. Each animal was loaded, walked in a slow circle to test the balance, and unloaded again if the walk revealed a problem the eye had missed. Some mules took 3 attempts before the load sat right. Nobody considered 3 attempts a delay. They considered it the job. The wagons turned back. No one watched them disappear. By sunset, every mile ahead depended on a mule. And it didn't take long for the mountains to begin asking a different question, not whether something was worth discovering, but whether it was worth carrying. The trouble started when 2 men wanted the same mule. One of the scientists found a pale, banded stone beside the trail, unlike anything in his notes, and wanted it carried back to Washington within the hour. A second man found something he wanted just as badly, a plant he'd never catalogued, pressed and boxed before it wilted. Both requests reached the same packer, because both requests landed on the same mule. That animal was already carrying 2 chemical cases and a week of grain, with almost nothing left to give. The 2 scientists stood over the packer's shoulder while he worked the numbers with his hands rather than paper. The rock could go on. The plant press could go on. Both could not. Not without something coming off. And grain was not something that came off. Nobody argued. That was the strange part. The 2 men who wanted their specimens carried simply waited, watching the packer sort through what the mule already held, the way men wait on a decision they know isn't theirs to make. In the end, it was the second scientist's own spare coat that came off the mule, folded and carried on his back for the rest of the week, so that both the rock and the plant press could ride. He didn't ask to keep the coat on the mule instead. He simply reached for it and started folding, because he understood the arithmetic as well as the packer did, and there was only one thing in that load that belonged to him alone. This happened again the next day, with water samples sealed in glass that weighed almost nothing empty, and considerably more once they held anything worth studying. None of it was refused outright. All of it cost something. Every specimen collected meant a decision about what would not be carried instead. And those decisions belonged to the packers, who understood animal limits better than anyone standing over a rock with a notebook. By the end of the first week past the wagons, 3 mules carried almost nothing but rock, water, and pressed plants. And the men walked a little more of the distance themselves than they had planned to, because their own boots did not require grain to keep moving forward. Discovery, it turned out, was not free. Someone always paid for it, in ounces. By the end of the first week, another lesson had begun to reveal itself. The scientists might decide where the expedition was going, but something else decided how fast it could get there. The ground narrowed before the danger did. A trail wide enough for 2 mules abreast became, without warning, a trail wide enough for one. Loose shale on one side, a drop on the other, that nobody needed measured to understand. The lead animals slowed on their own, ears back, testing the footing before committing their weight to it. A good packer read that hesitation and trusted it. A scientist, 3 animals back, thinking about elevation readings, did not. At the narrowest point, 1 mule stopped outright and would not be led forward. Not stubbornness. The animal had seen something in the footing that a man's eye had missed, and no amount of coaxing from the rope changed its mind. The packer leading it did not fight the animal. He backed it up, walked the 6 feet of trail himself first, found the loose section the mule had already refused to trust, and led the animal around it, by a different line entirely. 20 minutes, lost. Nobody complained, because 20 minutes lost to a careful mule was considerably cheaper than a mule, its load, and possibly a man, lost to an uncareful one. While the packer walked the trail himself, nobody urged the animal forward. Nobody suggested a faster way around. The whole column simply waited, watching 1 mule refuse to move. The mule was probably right. Further on, a second animal lost its footing, crossing a stream swollen higher than the map said it should be, and came up soaked, but upright, its load listing hard to the left. 2 packers had it rebalanced and retied within minutes, working in water to the knee. saying almost nothing to each other. Because the work required no discussion, only two men, who had done it enough times to need none. The scientists rode when the ground allowed it, and walked when it didn't. And either way, the expedition moved at a pace it did not choose. It moved at the pace the animals judged safe, on ground the animals tested before any man did. And no rank in that column outranked a mule's decision that a piece of trail could not be trusted. Science set the destination. The animals, that week, set the schedule. Then, after days of climbing, the mountains finally answered the question that had brought them there. The smell arrived before anything else did. Sulfur, faint at first, carried on the wind from somewhere ahead, unremarkable enough that the first man to notice it said nothing, assuming it was nothing. A mile on, the ground had changed, warmer through boot leather, in places with no reason to be warm, though nothing yet explained why. Another mile, and steam showed through the trees ahead, thin and pale against the dark timber, rising from ground, still hidden from view. The lead mules balked 100 yards out, and would not be hurried forward, nostrils working, ears back. Nobody forced them faster than they were willing to go. And for a while, the whole column simply stood in the trees, waiting on animals that understood something was wrong before any man could see what it was. Then, the trees broke, and the ground opened into pools of water, rolling at a full boil, with no flame under them. They had entered the basin visitors today know as Mammoth Hot Springs. One of the scientists crouched beside the nearest pool and did not speak. Nobody threw a celebration. What happened instead was that the work changed shape. Measurements had to be taken, which meant instruments unpacked and kept steady on ground too warm to set a case down on carelessly. Sketches had to be made, which meant paper and pencils, exposed to steam that curled paper if a man wasn't careful. Water samples had to be collected from pools hot enough to blister an ungloved hand, which meant new caution added to every existing caution already required of this trip. To the men doing the carrying, this was not a discovery. It was a new category of object that had to survive the return journey, exactly as fragile as the glass plates, twice as unpredictable, and considerably harder to explain to a mule. Here, on the ground, it was simply the next thing that had to be packed. The first impossible discovery had been made, but discovering Yellowstone was only half the journey. Now, they had to carry it home. Morning inspections had once taken only a few minutes. Walk the string, check the packs, tighten a loose strap, move. But south of the Mammoth Terraces, the routine had changed. The trail looked solid enough until the first mule stepped onto it. Thin sheets of mineral crust hid softer ground beneath. Every few yards, a mule stopped to test the surface before trusting it with another step. The delay repeated itself so often that nobody noticed it anymore. Progress slowed long before the day's work officially began. Nobody complained. They simply started earlier. One packer moved quietly down the line of loaded mules. First animal, nothing. Second, nothing. Third, still balanced. At the fourth, he stopped. He rested one hand against the load, not pushing, feeling. His other hand followed, tracing the leather hitch inch by inch. The straps had dried hard overnight. Steam drifted through camp long after sunset. Leather left beside the fire never dried evenly anymore. Every morning, another strap needed tightening. He stayed there longer than usual. "I don't like this." He hadn't raised his voice. He didn't need to. The nearest packer crossed over immediately. Then another. Within moments, the entire column had paused, without anyone giving an order. The cook stood waiting with the coffee pot hanging from one hand. Nobody asked what was wrong. They trusted the man who had stopped. A short distance away, one of Hayden's scientists continued working while the others gathered around the mule. He uncorked a glass bottle collected the evening before, compared the color of the water against a page of notes, copied a number into his journal, then sealed it again before the morning damp softened the paper. The load had shifted only a few inches, not enough for a man to notice by sight, enough for the mule to carry it all morning, and enough for the glass plates to begin touching one another before noon. The straps came loose, the blanket folded back. Two men lowered the wooden case together, careful not to let its weight fall during the last few inches. Another opened the lid. One plate after another came out into the morning light. Each edge was checked. Each plate returned to the slot it had come from. No cracks. The divider went back. The lid closed. The latch fastened. Only then did someone kneel beside the mule. A hand ran slowly along the animal's spine, searching for the sore place that had not formed yet, but would have before evening if the load had stayed where it was. Nothing. Behind them, the unloaded mule lowered its head. Its eyes closed. No one disturbed it. The load went back together, in the same order every experienced packer knew by memory. Blanket, frame, weight balanced from side to side, final hitch. One man walked the mule in a slow circle. Every eye stayed on the packs. Nothing shifted. How long? The question came from somewhere farther down the line. However long it takes. No one argued. 20 minutes had disappeared from the morning. No one mentioned them again. The first strap tightened. The mule opened its eyes. The scientist closed his notebook. The mule leaned into its collar first. The others followed. The expedition moved forward again. A few hundred yards later, the steam waiting ahead swallowed the trail once more. As the days passed, the expedition stopped adapting to Yellowstone. Instead, Yellowstone began changing the way they lived. Steam began deciding the day's routine before any man had spoken a word. Before sunrise, it drifted quietly through camp, thin enough to pass for morning mist. By breakfast, it had settled into the low places around the tents, hiding patches of ground everyone had crossed safely the evening before. Nothing about the camp looked different, yet every man had learned to pause before taking the first step outside his bedroll. The cook reached for the same patch of ground he had used the previous morning to set down the coffee pot. A hand caught his wrist. Not there. He looked down. The dirt appeared no different from the rest of the clearing, but heat shimmered through it, in waves almost too faint to notice. He moved 3 paces away before setting the pot down. The next patch looked no different from the first. He tested it with the back of his hand before lowering the pot. Nobody laughed. The warning had become part of breakfast. Later that morning, the mule string stopped beside a narrow stream winding away from the terraces. One of the lead animals lowered its head to drink. The nearest packer tightened the rope immediately. No, the mule resisted for only a second before following the rope. Whatever smell had drawn it there disappeared behind the rest of the string. The water looked clear enough. It wasn't. The animal followed, without resisting, as the string searched for another crossing farther upstream. By midday, the scientists had already changed the way they worked. One man laid his notebook on a flat rock while uncorking a bottle. By the time he reached for it again, the pages had begun curling from the warmth rising through the stone. He flattened them beneath his specimen case instead. Beside him, another scientist compared the morning's water temperature with the readings taken the day before. The numbers differed by only a few degrees. He checked the thermometer again. The second reading matched the first. He wrote both numbers into the journal without comment. Yesterday's numbers belonged to yesterday. The steam found its way into everything. Leather dried stiff before evening. Coats carried the smell of sulfur, no matter how long they hung in open air. Hands that spent the day handling mineral-stained water slowly darkened around the nails until the stains looked permanent. Nobody mentioned it anymore. Sulfur simply became another thing they wore. Before dawn on the fourth morning, one of the older hands walked the edge of camp, making the same quiet circuit he made every day. He stopped beside a sleeping man. The ground beneath the bedroll felt warm, not hot, warmer than it had been the night before. Without waking him, he dragged the entire bedroll several feet across the clearing. The sleeper rolled over once and kept snoring. The older hand continued his rounds. By sunrise, nobody remembered the bedroll had ever been somewhere else. When the column finally packed to leave, the steam had erased every footprint made the previous evening. The camp looked untouched. Only the cooling fire remained. Everything else had already disappeared into the steam. The deeper they traveled, the less they expected yesterday's trail to exist tomorrow. By the time they broke camp the following morning, nobody expected the trail to remain the same for very long. Yellowstone had cured them of that expectation. The runoff channel ahead had not been there when one of the scientists marked it on his sketch the previous afternoon. Or rather, it had. It simply hadn't been there in that shape. Warm water had carved another section of its bank away during the night, widening the crossing until the narrow shelf beside it would no longer take two loaded mules safely. The column stopped. No one asked why. Every man could already see it. Steam drifted low across the channel, hiding the edge of the shelf whenever the wind settled. Beyond it, the ground looked firm enough. But nobody trusted appearances anymore. One mule could cross, two could not. The lead packer studied the crossing for several seconds. Then he looked toward a wooden case strapped high on the third mule. Glass plates. He reached for the straps before anyone spoke. "I'll carry it." Nobody argued. Two men loosened the hitch together. Another folded the blanket clear. The case came down slowly between waiting hands, until it rested on the ground without a single jolt. The packer checked the leather handles, then checked them again. Nearby, one of Hayden's scientists closed his notebook without writing another word. He closed the notebook around one finger to keep his place, and stepped beside the crossing, not to help carry, simply to be there, if something happened. The packer lifted the case against his chest. Both forearms wrapped around it. Nothing else mattered. until it reached the far side. He stepped onto the shelf. One boot, then the other. Steam drifted across the trail again. The far edge disappeared. He stopped. Nobody behind him moved. Even the mules seemed to wait. The steam thinned. Another step. Halfway across, the shale beneath his left boot shifted. Only a little. Enough. A pebble skipped over the edge. It struck stone once. Again. Then farther down. The sound grew smaller, until only the water remained. The packer never looked after it. His eyes stayed on the next place his boot intended to land. He shifted his weight, waited for the ground to answer. It held. One more step, then another. When both boots reached solid ground, he did not celebrate. He knelt, set the case down carefully, opened the lid, lifted the divider. One plate at a time, he turned each into the light, checked every edge, every corner, every surface. Still no cracks. He replaced the divider, closed the lid, fastened the latch. Only then did he look up. The scientist was already standing there, both hands held out. Neither man spoke. The case changed owners. One nod, nothing more. Behind them, the crossing started again. The first mule came through empty, then another. When every animal stood safely on the far bank, the loads went back exactly as they had been before. Blanket, frame, cases, straps, balance checked twice. The column formed itself without instruction. No one mentioned the delay. The expedition simply continued south. The scientist reopened his notebook while walking. Without slowing, he added a single line beneath the previous entry. Crossing altered overnight, new route required. Then he closed the book again. Ahead, another column of steam rose quietly beyond the trees. Nobody wondered what it was. They kept walking. By evening, the crossing already belonged to yesterday. Nobody mentioned it while camp went up. The mules were unloaded in the same order they had been every evening since leaving the railroad. Blankets first, then frames, then the wooden cases. Each one passed from hand to hand, without needing directions. Nobody hurried. Nobody wasted movement. The column had repeated the same routine often enough, that every man already knew where the next pair of hands would be waiting. One packer spread a saddle blanket across a fallen log and began rubbing dust from the leather with a piece of cloth. He stopped. One buckle had been repaired. He turned it over once in his hand. The stitching wasn't his. He looked across the fire. Another packer was oiling a harness. Their eyes met. One nodded. The other nodded back. Nothing more needed saying. Nearby, someone held out an awl before it had been asked for. The tool changed hands. A moment later, it came back. No words. Just another piece of work. Finding the person who needed it. Judge stood quietly beside the grain sack, while one of the younger hands checked each hoof with a small pick. Another mule had a strap removed, before it could begin rubbing the same place again tomorrow. No one called attention to it. That had become part of the evening. Across the camp, the scientists worked beneath the last of the daylight. One man flattened fresh plants into the press before tightening the straps another notch. Beside him, another labeled bottles gathered from the day's springs, careful to match each number with the notes written earlier while walking. A third spread several rock specimens across a blanket, comparing them one final time before packing them into the wooden case that would ride another day's trail tomorrow. One scientist waited for the steam to thin before reopening his notebook. Another packed the last specimen case before the light disappeared. Nobody suggested those habits. By now, everyone simply worked that way. As darkness settled over camp, supper finished without conversation lasting very long. The day's work had already been discussed while it was happening. There was little left to add. One of Hayden's scientists crossed the camp, carrying a notebook beneath his arm. He stopped beside the packer who had carried the glass plates across the shelf that afternoon. "Everything made it," he said. The packer was tightening the final stitch in a saddle strap. He pulled the thread once, tested it, then set the strap beside tomorrow's load. It was supposed to. The scientist smiled once. He returned to his own fire. Around camp, the last small jobs disappeared one by one. A lantern went dark. A coffee pot was rinsed. Harnesses were stacked beneath canvas before the night dew settled. The specimen cases stood together beneath a tarp. Every buckle, every rope, every strap, ready for morning. When the fires finally burned low, there was nothing left unfinished. One lantern disappeared, then another. The specimen cases stood beneath their canvas. The harnesses hung where morning hands would find them. Beyond the trees, another column of steam climbed quietly into the night. By sunrise, someone would already be walking toward it. Eventually, every expedition reaches the same moment. The moment when the work turns toward home. Morning started the way every morning had started for weeks. Coffee first, then the mules. A packer worked down the line, hand flat against each hitch, feeling for anything that had shifted overnight. Nothing had. He moved to the next animal anyway. One of the scientists still turned his shoulder before he opened his notebook, angling it toward nothing. The cook set the coffee pot down on the nearest patch of open ground without a second thought. The trail boy leading the string still tested the ground with one boot before trusting his weight to it, though it had never once given way under anyone here. One of the older hands, walking the line a final time, paused at the fourth mule out of habit, his hand resting there a moment before he moved on. "Old habits," he said. To nobody. Nobody answered him. The last ribbon of steam behind them thinned above the trees and was gone. The trail bent west. Nobody looked back. It simply continued. Weeks later, the trail had become something quieter. Home. The horse stopped in front of the house on a cold afternoon, and the packer swung down, then stood there a moment before he did anything else. His wife came out with a bucket of water. He reached for it, stopped, looked down at the ground beneath his own boots, set his pack down slowly, the way he'd learned to set anything down that summer, and only then took the bucket from her hands. She didn't ask why. She'd known him long enough to let a pause pass without comment. That evening, he unpacked his gear in the barn, unrolled the blankets, and hung them to air out the way he'd hung them 100 times that summer. Wiped down the saddle before oiling it, working the leather the way he'd worked it by firelight, beside a dozen other men doing the same thing. Cleaned the mud from his boots at the door, checking the soles for wear, the way a man checks something he expects to need again soon. He checked the girth strap on his way out of the barn, walked halfway to the house, stopped, looked back at it once, then went back, and checked it again. Nothing was wrong with it either time. At supper, He moved his chair a few inches farther from the fire before he sat down. Nobody at the table thought anything of it. In the morning, he loaded the wagon for the trip into town. Ordinary crates of ordinary goods. Nothing fragile, nothing that mattered if it shifted. He balanced the load anyway. Weight against weight. The same care he'd have given a case of glass plates on a bad grade. Some journeys stay with a man long after the mountains disappear behind him. While the packers returned to ordinary life, their work continued, hundreds of miles away. By the time the journey ended, the trail had become a railway, and the railway a warehouse beneath gaslight. The same crates that had crossed rivers and broken shelves of trail now came open, one at a time. The glass negatives lifted out first. Every plate came out whole. The water samples next, uncorked into clean vials for testing, drawn months earlier from pools that had gone on boiling, long after the bottles left. The plants, pressed flat and dried against sun-warmed stone. The notebooks, soft-cornered from a summer of damp mornings. Henry Jackson went through the negatives himself, holding each to a lamp, checking exposure, setting some aside, and keeping others. Thomas Moran worked from his own sketches and Jackson's plates together, mixing color against print, building paintings meant for a room. None of the men who had protected these images through steam and river crossings would ever see. Ferdinand Hayden cross-referenced one man's water readings against another's, correcting a date, adding a line, building nearly 500 pages from notebooks written beside pools 2,000 miles away. He carried the report to Spencer Baird at the Smithsonian. Congress received it that winter. The maps, the photographs, the paintings, spread across a table, closing a blank space. 40 years of eyewitness accounts had never managed to fill. Nobody in that room had crossed a bad shelf of trail with a case of glass plates locked against his chest. But everything on that table had. On the 1st of March, Congress passed the act. In the end, Yellowstone did not travel to Washington by rail. It traveled there one careful mile at a time. It traveled on muleback, across rivers that rose overnight, across shelves of trail that broke away underfoot, through steam that hid the ground ahead, inside wooden cases, checked every morning, by men who understood a shifted load before they understood the science riding inside it. The photographs were opened, the report unfolded, the maps were spread across the table. Years later, on a small farm far from anywhere Yellowstone had ever touched, that same packer loaded hay onto a wagon for a neighbor. First bale, nothing. Second, nothing. Third, nothing. At the fourth, he rested one hand against it, not pushing, feeling. He tightened the rope, picked up the next bale. The wagon rolled away. He kept working. Most Americans would remember the names Hayden, Jackson, Moran. Few would remember the men who carried their work. But without the packers, without the mule skinners, without the men who checked every strap, balanced every load, and refused to hurry a dangerous trail, there would have been no photographs to believe, no report to read, and perhaps no Yellowstone National Park at all. Sometimes history remembers the discoveries and forgets the people who carried the proof.